Yeah, Sasha, if you could sit on the stool. And those little gifts are for you guys. All right. So this particular panel was inspiring to, again, in this concept of problem statement solution theme, how is it that some of our materials, as we think about things moving from the point of our use into wastewater treatment or into compost piles, into dye pots, this idea of just thinking about, if we're looking at the soil to soil framework, which Fibershed is very immersed in, building soil carbon, building regenerated landscapes, healthy soils that produce dyes and fiber that you then wear, you utilize, and then hopefully those materials return back to that soil to add more carbon to that system. So we have a closed loop system based on biogeochemistry, and it's the relationship between the atmosphere and the pedosphere that make all of this happen. So within the biosphere, what are we, human actors, doing to move materials in certain directions, and how does the movement of those materials in certain directions affect our collective health, well-being, and ecosystem function? So this particular panel is very exciting to me because these are all people who are all working with the waste stream in some way, in an experimental way mostly, because composting clothing, I will say, for most people it's kind of like, I didn't know you could do that. So I'm going to let these individuals introduce themselves. We're going to start with Evan from the California Alliance of Family Farmers and the Farmers Guild. And I'm going to hand you this, and if you want to come up.
Yeah, I'll do that. Sure. All right, is this thing just clued up here? All right. So first off, thank you so much for having me. This has been a really wonderful event so far. Beautiful fabrics and textiles. During lunch, we got to see a rabbit get sheared. That was a first for me. There was even a station where they were mending clothing out there on the lawn. That was really cool. I got a little patch on my shirt. But I asked them if they could help me with some mending of my underwear. And they refused me. I don't know what that's about, but so I'm going to, before I even explain what this is all about, I'm just going to show you a video. Is that cool? All right. We get that volume on. Getting ready for the Soil My Undies Challenge. So, healthy soil is hungry soil. And what that means is you've got soil that's full of microbiological activity. You've got earthworms, you've got nematodes, bacteria, and they're all underground, eating away, transferring nutrients, and providing a really resilient, healthy biome. This is a simple pair of 100% cotton underwear. You can get it at any store. All you need to do is bury it in your soil, in your pasture, in your garden. You leave it there for 2 months. You come back, you dig it up. And if you have dead soil, if it's totally lifeless and requires inputs of synthetic fertilizers and whatnot, what you should be able to do is pull it up out of the ground, throw it in the washing machine, and put them on like nothing ever happened. If, however, you have incredibly healthy soil, full of all that microbiological activity, you should have nothing left but an elastic strap. So all those little life forms should be underground, eating away at the cotton, which is an organic material. So we're here with Elizabeth, who's going to be our first guinea pig.
Oh, goodness.
And so here's how it works. Why don't you come on over? So the important thing is you want to get the topsoil. Oh, look at that. Look at that right there. He's hungry. He's ready for it. We'll work for him. The important thing is that as long as it's totally submerged in the soil, it doesn't have to be super, super deep, because in fact, the most active part of the soil is often just a top couple inches. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the star of the Soil My Undies Challenge right here. You ready, buddy? All right. Team Singing Frogs Farm right here. MVP. Okay. All right. So, let's get it nice and buried.
Okay. Under there, and then we'll just cover you up.
Cover it up. And simply put a marker, a flag, anything so you know where to come back. And again, that's 2 months. Then we're asking folks is you come back, you dig it up, and you bring it to the Petaluma Fairgrounds on September 16th. We're going to be hosting our agrarian games, kind of like a farmer Olympics. We're going to put all the underwear clothesline, and we're going to have our climate smart specialist there to evaluate what's left of these underpants and find out how you can increase your soil microbiological activity. And ladies and gentlemen, give it a try at your own farm, at your own garden, and we hope to see you at Bedlam Fairgrounds September 16th.
All right. So we had a lot of fun with this. These are just a few snapshots of farmers all over California that were giving it a try, and it was really great. This is a very unscientific test of soil health. I'm going to be introducing our true scientific mind from our team, Sara Tiffany, to come up and talk about how unscientific my project was. But what I do want to talk about, though, is the power of humor and videos and simply getting the conversation started. And what I really appreciate about the Fibershed is they're taking these ideas, these very complex, often, we're talking about holistic systemic change. We're talking about, that last presentation was incredible. And I understand, just a tiny fraction of it, big, really important ideas, but how do we actually communicate that to the general public? So that video, I never thought that I'd become famous with underwear. I thought it would be something else. But we reached over 100,000 people with that. We got written up in newspapers all over America. And last week, I had my first, and I hope not only, but interview on BBC. So talking about underwear. And what's cool is that I could have gone up and talked about the intricacies of carbon farming and sequestering carbon and nematodes and whatnot. But the fact that we were able to use something like this humor, fun, getting people to have it be interactive. We had more people asking questions when they started seeing people all over social media, farmers burying their underwear. It starts, it lends itself to a question, the obvious question, what the hell are you guys doing? Which then requires an answer, and they're actually listening because they're really curious. So we had the opportunity as an organization to actually answer that question now worldwide. So I encourage you to try it yourself. I have a whole bag of underwear over there if you want to come check it out. Most all the farmers that we worked with came back with underwear that looked a lot like this. My guess is that the folks whose underwear did come up more intact probably didn't show, they probably didn't show up with their underwear, right? I mean, that's kind of embarrassing to admit that. But I would love to see some more scientific analysis of all that. And obviously there's various variables involved. It's far more complex than simply burying your underwear. But it's a good conversation starter, and so I encourage you guys to think about all the incredible, important work that you guys are doing here at the Fibershed and all your various capacities, and think about how can you share this with a broader general audience through fun and humor and getting people involved. So now the science behind it. I would love to introduce the real brains behind our operation. That's Sara Tiffany. Thank you.
Brains and a little less height here. I think it's pretty obvious that the brains behind that was actually Evan. We're gonna get into the panel, so I'll just briefly introduce myself. I'm Sara Tiffany. I'm the climate smart farming specialist at the Community Alliance with Family Farmers. And what we try to do is we try to marry the two stories of what farmers are doing, and in terms of climate smart farming, these different practices they can do. What are their experiences in terms of production, in terms of their economic well-being, in terms of what's pragmatic on their farm, and marrying that to the science behind these different practices. And at the end of the day, a lot of time the star of the show is the life in the soil. And it's the microbes, it's the macrofauna, the earthworms, all of these guys that are in charge of breaking down nutrients and breaking down organic materials and turning them back into nutrients that will then become part of life that we can eat again. So it's this amazing cycle of life and death that happens in the soil. And so, the whole point of the Soil My Undies challenge was to really have a visual representation of just how alive that soil is. And Evan didn't mention this, but this was not organic underwear, right? So obviously, after the last presentation, we know very well that the next challenge is going to be only organic, natural dyed materials. But it is an example, because if you look at this, all that's left is the synthetic materials. The cotton is completely gone, because cotton is it's just carbon, right? So that can just be eaten up by the life in the soil. But what's left is the synthetic polyester fibers, the elastic, all of that stuff. That is left. They didn't want any part of that. Of course, we could bury it, come back in 50, 100 years, and maybe it'd be a different story. But, it's just a way of getting the conversation going. So that's kind of what it's all about.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for having me here. And this morning was very inspirational. This is not the kind of conference I'm used to. This is not an academic conference. And so, very different. And at the same time, the location is very different. I am from the Fashion Institute of Technology, and we are in Midtown, New York. So, very, very different. And so it's kind of an irony that I'm going to talk to you about compost from 7th and 27th Street in New York. Okay, but this is what we have done at FIT. How many of you are designers here? And as you know, most fashion designers use muslin as the prototype. Certainly our students at FIT do. And muslin, as you know, is a very inexpensive, cheap fabric, but this is what is used for prototypes. What our students do, as I'm sure the industry does, is after it's used for prototypes, it just goes to the landfill, and that's a waste. And even at FIT, we generate about 100 pounds of muslin a week. And so 2 of my students in the textile development and marketing program, they took my textile fibers class, and they were very inspired. So the first question was, can we degrade cotton down to compost? And then they researched and said, there's not much research about that. And I said, if you want some brownie points, that's your way to do it. So they actually began, and you will see their pictures in a minute. So they began this project. We are divided in 2 departments, so we are not fashion design, so we don't use the muslin. But they worked with students in fashion design, and they had collection buckets all over the place. And then we wrote a grant to the FIT President's Sustainability Council, and we got a grant to do this work. And so that is where it all began. And so the first step was, of course, to collect all the muslin. And then we looked at all the muslin, worked with the fashion design students. Lots of muslin, as I said, 100 pounds a week. And then we bought a composter. So we took all this muslin. Now, the problem was we don't own a fabric shredder. And so the first problem was it is physically impossible to shred all this muslin. And so with a great deal of discomfort, we had to send our muslin to North Carolina to an industrial shredder. So it was shredded there. It was shipped back to FIT. And then we got food waste from our dining halls. So food waste from the dining halls, coffee grinds from the local Starbucks, and that was added to the composter. No meat products at all. So this is just a food waste from the dining hall and all the muslin that we could get. And just to give you an idea, this is from their research. Just to process cotton, of course, takes a lot of water. And so if we can recycle this for some other use, it's just a huge saving. This is just one way of doing it. People are also recycling and upcycling, downcycling in other ways as well. And then it took us about, since this was an experimental project, this was a prototype, it took about 3 months to take that muslin and completely downgrade it to compost. Oops. Now, a second group of students had the idea that since we use a lot of dyes, why don't we have our own natural dye garden? And so, again, the president of FIT was happy, and she has her office on the 9th floor, but there's a garden on the 9th floor as well. And so she gave us plots on that garden. And so we had plots for the natural dye garden. Then we took the compost that we made from the muslin and put it in those plots and started growing indigo. You can see some here, kind of the same marigolds, some coreopsis, and some other dyes as well. So the idea was to close the loop. So you take something that would normally go to a landfill, you create something useful out of that, you then grow natural dyes using that compost, then we extracted all of that dye and put it back onto cotton. And so this is what we have for, so we took all that indigo that we grew, extracted all that indigo, and the students then dyed the shirt in our cotton. We also have a laser engraver, so we have the FIT logo on it as well. And so also on the muslin, so they also wanted to take the other muslin that was left, and they created, the idea was to make this kind of table covers. With the muslin, again, that would go to a landfill. And so they just took the muslin, dyed it with the indigo, grown with the compost muslin, and then put it on the fabric. So. Thank you. And so that's our mascot, obviously, but that's our 9th floor natural dye garden. I'm going to flip through a few slides. This is Lydia and Willa. These are the two students that worked. We, of course, had lots of volunteers, but Lydia on the left, Willa to the right, were two of the main students that worked on this project. But I'm going to flip through the next few slides because, of course, everyone here is involved in farm to fashion. We are trying to do a similar thing in New York as well, and we are working. This past summer, we grew some flax on a farm in Westchester, and then we are working with the New England Linen Group to take this flax and then process, and you've heard all of those steps this morning, the scutching, the retting, the everything. And then one of our alums is going to take that flax and put it into our line, and that will be on sale hopefully next summer. So again, a complete thing done very, very locally. So the flax is grown locally, everything is grown locally, and we are trying to do the same thing with hemp. The governor of New York wants in upstate New York project for hemp, and so we are part of the State University of New York, and so SUNY, FIT, and other SUNY universities are working on that as well. And so I'm just going to, and so both of these projects that I talked about were won prizes at the Clinton Global Initiative project, and then we also got money from the EPA P3 grant. If you're aware of the P3 grant, is the People, Planet, and Prosperity from the Environmental Protection Agency, and so we now have in our lab, because we can't grow it on the farm all the time, but we have it in our lab now, growing chambers that we are now growing cotton, we can grow indigo, we can grow any type of plant. But we also have a small 1-acre plot in Westchester, so we're just trying to do some studies on whether lab studies match up with farm studies as well. But that is what we are doing. This is flax from this past summer, cotton. This is the students harvesting, and then, but that's the idea. Thank you.
Okay, 2 inches. Hi, everybody. My name is Sasha Duerr. You can see up here, I'm very honored and happy to be here today. And I am going to talk along similar lines of compost and work that I do in my own practice with plant dyeing, but also the work that we do at California College of the Arts. I often like to work with byproducts, especially I love working with chefs because I love the beauty and joy that comes out of experiences, and then a byproduct and a product of color that follows. But I'm going to move fairly quickly through these slides, so consider it a little bit of a feast for your eyes as we go through. Let's see. So, compost colors. There are so many ways to kind of actually think about this in terms of both added value and also next life, and how you can put color back into your work and also put your work back into the soil and get more color and more other many benefits from it as well. I am a professor at California College of the Arts, as you probably just saw, and I'm also the author of 2 dye books. The latest one came out about a year ago. It's called Natural Color. I got to work with the lovely people at 10 Speed Press, and my editor was a cookbook editor, so it was amazing to work with her because it helped to kind of think through a lot of the byproducts and put recipes forward very simply in the way that you might if you're a chef, which is how I love to work with natural dyes, is thinking seasonally and also thinking a lot about biodiversity. And fortunately, both California College of the Arts and my own studio is based in the East Bay in Berkeley, and so there's a lot of people to work with that are very well trained in biodiversity and working with plants. Here's just an image from Natural Color. These are all winter dye plants that I feature, and I often like to feature the waste quote because it's really up to, I think, a person in the society as to what they consider waste. But these are often things that we throw away, like orange peels or citrus peels in general. I added in a recipe for blue spruce to the left up there because I grew up on a Christmas tree farm, and holiday season is upon us, and it's often really, really difficult for me to go out onto the street and to see all these Christmas trees just sitting there. And they make beautiful dyes of multiple colors and varieties. And so even just being able to see visually and to understand these plants from a 360-degree perspective, I think is so valuable for us to understand like the gaps and to see the visible in what is currently invisible, perhaps, of potential and possibility. Here's Natural Color. I kind of just gave it a plug and explained it to you, so I'm going to move through. It was also inspired by something. This was a project that I've been thinking about for a long time because I love working seasonally, and I work seasonally because I like to work with whole dye plants, not with extracts, and I love doing that because typically it's more sensory for me personally, but I also love working with what's available and what's local, and this is something that all of our fiber sheds and what we're doing here and what Rebecca has done with illuminating fiber sheds, it's so important to see what you have available immediately around you. And so this is a seasonal color wheel for San Francisco Bay Area, and these are just suggestions because just like any chef, you will have your own way and maybe even your own colors that come from the very same plant season to season, year to year, person to person. So these are all suggestions of colors and also suggestions of plants. And how I structured this was thinking about what are seasonal produce at different times of year that are abundant, say at the San Francisco Ferry Plaza building, or that are easily grown or harvested at different times of year. And then also, what are the waste products too, or prunings, or there are some trees even in our climate that shed their leaves abundantly at different times of the year. And so thinking about that became kind of the focus of this, and then also visually making it present for people to see it because it's hard to dig through a dye book sometimes. So being able to see these colors all at once and in one way became a really good visual tool. Also, too, besides San Francisco, I've done color wheels for New York and for Honolulu. My family's in Hawaii. And thinking really, it's a really interesting exercise to think about compost from different areas and a lot of research and talking to chefs and seeing what they like to work with. And then also, too, thinking about what are the most abundant trees in New York or in LA or in Hawaii that could give you byproducts. And this is for anywhere, really. Like, you can think about this in your own towns. I also love working collaboratively, and I teach at CCA under the guise of textiles, but really I'm very focused on community arts and social practice. In my own practice with plant dyes, having a good partnership is like the best thing in the world, and I love working with all different kinds of businesses, and specifically there's so many different people who work with plants on on a number of levels. Okay, I have 1 minute, so it's really going to be a visual feast. Anyway, these are colors all from Byrite, San Francisco, and waste products, just rinds and peels and black bean water, just different things that you wouldn't think of using otherwise, typically. On the left is from the Ojai farmers market. So even specific farmers markets can have particular colors at particular times. Ojai too, because of the citrus. That's a big branding element for them. Plants really are storytellers, in my opinion. Here's another, as part of research and kind of the work that I do, this was a project I did, a year-long research project at Gospel Flat Farm. It's called Seasonal Color and Taste Palette. This is us doing a seasonal tasting for orange, and we used all of the peels and tested out different varieties from them. Here's some of the images. I'm just going to more quickly go through them. And then we had a dinner, too, with all of the plants that we worked with, but the parts you would eat, not the parts you would dye with. Here's some of the colors. Also, too, thinking about weeds and waste and really what we consider weeds and waste. This was a project I did called Sheep and Weeds many years ago, but this was all local wool dyed with weeds that the sheep would eat and we might not consider. And then also we got to eat some of them in new forms too. That's the leftover dye in the middle. And then this was a old knitwear company I had, but also thinking about weeds and waste too. This is all natural alpaca, including the black band, but it was dyed with oxalis, a weed, and waste from avocado pits in local restaurants. She's also standing in a field of fava, which is also a great dye. And then this is my final portion, and we'll get to questions with Rebecca. But at CCA, we have a community garden. It was really started out of the need for compost for me personally, because otherwise I love just working with waste and weeds. But teaching soil to studio class that I've taught, this is my 10th year teaching it, I was not wanting to have a garden at CCA because it's a lot of work for an adjunct, but because we didn't have compost on campus, I felt I absolutely could not teach natural dyeing in the cycles I wanted to. So we created a garden actually to compost. And then I'm going to go through these quickly and then we're done. So I always start out the semester in the spring with having somebody who's a compost expert like Christopher Sheehan up here. He's a permaculture expert, and he comes in and talks to our students about composting in general. And then in the middle of the semester, we do something called Weed Your Wardrobe, and basically where we weed out our garden because enough things have grown by then, and we learn about those weeds and we understand their function and make things out of them, including dyeing our textiles. Unwanted textiles that students bring in. So really considering what we consider waste. And then this is final to last slide, but we also have an edible component to our garden, and here's some students collecting for our potluck at the end of the year, our harvest meal. We like to work with a lot of the byproducts and experiment with those too. And then, fortunately, I have I have a student here who is a student for 4 years of mine and the garden manager, our fiber and dye garden manager, Rosa, and some of you may have met her outside. But she made this beautiful poster on the left for us, and it was the introduction of our seed library. This was 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago. And we had had a seed library for a long time, but she made a beautiful home for it. And it sits alongside the Fibershed Book of Wool in San Francisco and the Materials Library. And any student, faculty, or staff can come and check out fiber and dye seeds from that library. And we grow our own primary dye plants in the garden and save our seeds year to year, which is benefited from our compost. Anyway, thank you. Sorry for the...
All right. So I'm going to start with Sarah and Evan. And thank you all for the inspiration. This is very heartening from a visual and many different levels perspective. Appreciate your time explaining your work. It's beautiful. So I think for Sarah and Evan both, you can interchange on this question. how do you see, or could you speak to the textile composting process as supportive in actually building soil? You talked about the microbes digesting it, but do you have a vision for textiles becoming part of the soil building process? And if so, maybe elucidate a little bit more on that.
Yeah, so, as, all of these wonderful people have been talking about, when we're talking about natural fibers, essentially they came from the earth and they can go back to the earth. It's important to think about what condition they're in. And a huge aspect of it, is it still a 100% natural material? Or are there synthetic dyes in some of the compost that Gabrielle told us all about? And if we're working with either raw wool or raw wool, or we're working with fabrics that we've been using and we're sort of done with, and they've been naturally dyed, we can compost them. Obviously, it's been demonstrated. If there is synthetic dyes and whatnot in them. Another aspect that you would want, we really need more research on, is how those stick around in the compost and how those then become theoretically part of the ecology in the soil, if the microbes are able to break them down, or if they're not, if they're broken down in the composting process. Some are, some aren't. But at the end of the day, natural fibers are carbon sources, and wool actually is considered, in the composting world, it's considered a nitrogen-based feedstock, even though it is fairly low in nitrogen. So, one thing that I would encourage people to remember is that when we're talking about composting anything, whether it's natural fibers like cotton and wool or something else, you need both carbon and nitrogen in terms of actually controlling the decomposition process, because this is all driven, as I mentioned earlier, by microorganisms in the soil. And they're just like us. They need carbohydrates and they need protein, right? They use carbohydrates like we do to have energy, and they use protein in the form of nitrogen like we do to build their bodies. And so one important aspect to think about is that composting natural fibers is going to be more than just putting a pile of cotton out and just waiting for it to do its thing. Eventually it might, in a very, very long period of time, but what you need to do is, composting is almost considered like, it's like cooking. You have a recipe, right? So you need a carbon material, you need a nitrogen material, you need water, you need oxygen, you need heat, and you need time. And so when we're talking about fabrics and fibers, we just need to keep that in mind. It is absolutely possible to compost them, but we need to think about, are there synthetic dyes in them that we maybe don't want to go into our soil? And we need to think about what we need to add in order to speed up and make that composting process actually effective. So, for example, there's a source that says that some people are playing around with adding wool, for example, directly into their garden beds or directly into their farm soil. That can work out okay, but it's actually shown to acidify the soil to a certain extent. And I would argue that actually composting it, you might eventually actually get more out of it if you're composting it, because you're also adding in, maybe you're adding in manure, or maybe you're adding food or green waste to that. Maybe like we heard about adding coffee grinds. There's all of these different ingredients you can add to actually kind of elevate the quality of the compost, rather than just putting your old sweater in your garden. So that's something that I personally would encourage.
Thank you.
I do want to add something, and it's from a very different angle, but one of the conversations I'm sure that you guys have here at Fibershed is true cost accounting. And if we look at what it's actually going to take to get to a truly compostable fiber economy from a scalable perspective, we're going to have to start asking ourselves, how do we make
how do we make compostable, naturally produced fabrics as financially accessible as their artificial counterparts? And a lot of that does go back to externalized costs and whatnot, so it's a much bigger question. But I will tell you, during our Soil My Undies challenge, it was very hard to convince farmers to go out and purchase 100% organic, naturally dyed, or underwear. It's tough. It's expensive, right? So to ask ourselves, can we as individuals, encourage this kind of those kind of fabrics? It's certainly possible, but how do we make that also accessible to enough people so the actual system changes? So that's a much bigger conversation.
And that brings me to my question for you, Ajoy, that we wanted to know more about what do you see going forward on the technical side to scale us towards a zero waste prospect or a future potentially, and how do you see this is benefiting, of course, our farms and ranches, but in your case, it could just be to speak to the rooftop garden. But what are the technical barriers?
Well, one of the barriers, it's not technical, it's just that we don't have the machine, as I said. We have lots of fabric, but we just don't have the capital to buy a fabric shredder. So, and so we have applied for some grants to do that so that we can have our own fabric shredder. But we are also working with, there are many groups around in New Jersey, Connecticut, that are working on collecting used clothing and then recycling it by actually shredding it to some other uses. So we are talking with them in the hope that they can pick some of our fabric and the students can volunteer the time for them. So like our students can intern with them and they can shred the fabrics for us. But the idea here, the plan for us is just not to restrict ourselves to the roof garden. The idea is to go industrial in the sense we can use that compost on the farm in, this is Professor Silverman's farm in Westchester, and then spread the compost there and then do a scientific study. The one that I skipped over because we didn't have time is that when we did the EPA study, that was scientific in the sense that the idea there was to find out that adding compost, if you add compost, does it increase the color yield of the indigo? Does it increase the color yield of the coreopsis? What happens to the color fastness properties? What happens if you take that naturally dyed fabric and add other finishing chemicals to it? So let's say anti-wrinkle. So the idea is to go here, this was a pilot project, but to make it more industrially applicable so that the industry actually should adopt our methods. But to do that, we need more data. And so we have applied for a couple of grants for that.
Thank you. And Sasha, can you describe more about cultural practice as a mechanism for scaling? So, yeah, you get what I'm saying. All right.
I think that adaptation-wise, like some of the elements of believing in the system of buying organic has to do with people having a lived experience, first and foremost. And so I love the aspect of gathering around textiles and also looking at byproducts in our communities, often as person to person or community to community, and understanding what currently isn't being used, and for one that might be trash and for another it could be dyes or fibers. And so the community scalable aspect and the social aspect I think is really key. Because some people, especially with my students too, like they've made amazing partnerships, and I've personally made amazing collaborations and partnerships by working with people who have something that they wouldn't necessarily see as helpful, but you would, and vice versa. And I think that's a really key part of Fibershed and of scalability for making a community and a society and a global context work in a much higher functioning way.
And have you seen a larger scale avocado pit collection or black bean water process? Is it personal practice, or is there a...
Oh, I think it could totally be larger scale, and a lot of that has to do with, because of having my own knitwear line, like even at the realm that we were at with local fibers and spinning locally, we still were knitting in LA at that point. This was several years ago. But it was so easy to access more dye materials than we even knew what to do with. Even on the avocado front perspective, just going to one restaurant that serves guacamole to the masses is a garbage bag full. And I've collected just to look at how much, and that's a lot of dye. That's a lot. That could dye any mid-range independent dyer's season to a certain extent, to hundreds plus. And that's just one person and what's possible with one person. But if there were textile dye facilities that could help to enable this to the next level and the equipment to do that, I think there's even more possibility with taking back food waste and byproducts and adding in, especially from the dye perspective, the next level. And I'll just add this one part.
Please.
And then I went to a conference in France. It was several years ago in 2011. It was the International Symposium for Natural Dyes that was happening at that time. And Dominique Cardoon, who's the author of an amazing book called Natural Dyes.
Natural Dyes.
Natural
Yes.
Dyes. This thing, it is well worth the investment if you're serious. She's amazing. She and her partner, who was a chemist scientist, they worked with facilities in France where they could actually take large-scale waste products, basically chaparral, and print out everybody's bags in terms of like high-resolution, like printing from these old printing presses with natural dyes that were rescued from landscape restoration. And so these are the kind of things that are totally scalable and totally possible. And, you know, this is why this is important conversations to have.
Yeah,
So.
please.
And I should add to this that even the bigger dye companies are coming around to making sustainable dyes. So there's a global company by the name of Chroma. And what they have recently done is they have introduced dyes made from waste material. So the walnuts, for example, the shells that are thrown away, and some other nuts and as well. And so they have labeled their collection as earth colors. So the idea here is even the industry is looking towards sustainability to use sustainable materials to do, even the ones that were totally chemically focused at one time.
Thank you all. And Patagonia came out with a natural dye line in the last little while. I have some. So there is a way to scale, and I think and the price point is, I guess, a matter of time. But I think you make a good point, Evan, and we obviously need to make this work more accessible. So we are going to complete this panel. Is there anything, we'll do maybe one question, if anyone has a question for the group? Wow, you're all feeling very peaceful and maybe mentally fatigued, but that's, all right. Well, thank you all so much.